This is Phil Fish. This is Phil Fish. Phil is, or was, a game designer. He worked at Ubisoft, entered the indie scene through TigSource, founded Kokoromi, co-starred in the documentary Indie Game the Movie, and released a game called Fez. Maybe you heard of it. And everybody hates him. That's an exaggeration. If you don't hate Phil Fish, you probably either know somebody who does, or you have never heard of him. He's been called a racist, a liar, arrogant, overrated, and generally, quote, an asshole. End quote. This video is not about defending Phil Fish, or about setting him on fire. This video isn't even about Phil Fish. Not really. This video is about everyone in the world who isn't Phil Fish. We, and by we I mean those who would eventually be Phil's public, first met Phil on the forums at TigSource, sort of the indie game CBGBs. He was a talented artist that delivered very constructive, if blunt, critiques on the art subforums. He was one of dozens of strong personalities. He had a tendency to fly off the handle, though rarely unprovoked, even if it didn't seemingly take much provocation. You could most easily set him off by talking about who was and wasn't really indie. The point being, he wasn't a shit-talker. He was a guy who called out shit-talkers, though where you place that dividing line likely depends on your opinion of Phil Fish. Early in development, he started a devlog for Fez that quickly became the most popular devlog in TigSource history. The game around that time blew the fuck up on Twitter, and an early demo won an Excellence in Visual Art Award at the Independent Games Festival. Phil was becoming, quite rapidly, a big deal. He was the subject of dozens of articles and interviews, and quickly received funding from the Canadian government, based solely on his first commercial release, which was, at that time, little more than a prototype. This rankled many developers who had been releasing finished products for years in total obscurity. It is worth noting that Fez's popularity didn't really mean people thought it was better than other games in development. Fez's selling points were Phil's art, guided by his incredibly demanding standards, and its 2D 3D mechanic, which was near impossible to describe but could be instantly understood in motion. The game blew up on Twitter because it was perfectly suited to Twitter. Everything you needed to know about it could be understood in 4 seconds of video or even an animated GIF. It was a game that compressed well, and the more compressed information is, the further it can travel on the web. This took no particular genius on Phil's part. He simply lucked into an idea that elegantly fit the mold of how games became popular in 2008, and used that system superlatively. Other developers' games could be better, deeper, more cerebral, but not half as mimetic. But the way Phil acted in the face of this popularity seemed smug and self-satisfied, as if Phil felt it were owed to him. His acceptance speech for the art award at the IGF had no trace of humility or even surprise. In interviews, he often ranted about what was wrong with other games, much as he had on TigSource, with the tacit implication that Fez would be superior. And when folks shared their unvarnished, profanity-laden opinions with him on the internet, he responded right back in kind, as he had ever done. But before, if a complete stranger randomly told him to go fuck himself, no one cried foul if he told them to go fuck themselves right back. This was just two strangers flaming each other on the internet, and if anyone was in the wrong, it was the one who started it. But now Phil wasn't insulting a stranger, he was insulting the audience. This was interfacing with the public. The dynamic between these two people is viewed completely differently as soon as one of them becomes famous. To talk about Phil Fish is to talk about fame. More and more people began to speak toxically about Phil, and to Phil. Resentment began with developers, but soon expanded either by spreading out from TigSource or because Phil was just good at making enemies. The complaint that Phil had never released a game, lobbed at him most every time his name was mentioned on the internet, masked a deeper complaint. Hundreds of developers on TigSource had never finished a game, and no one complained about that. But none of them were famous. The deeper complaint wasn't that Phil was more famous than them, but that he was more famous than he deserved. At this point, Phil was basically Nickelback. Now, people don't hate Nickelback because they think the music is bad. People think loads of music is bad and don't give it any further thought. People hate Nickelback because the music is bad and popular. But it's more complicated than that. It's because someone at a studio heard Nickelback and thought, I can sell that. It's because the music was so aggressively overplayed on the radio and aggressively advertised as if a PR department were trying to sculpt a mediocre band into a sensation, regardless of worthiness. It's because, despite all the hate, Nickelback's fame proved that this was actually working, that millions were buying into it. It's because Nickelback represented the apotheosis of an existing trend of shallow, whiny hard rock, which they made even more popular and spawned legions of shallow, whiny imitators to continue the trend. It's because every step of this process seemed to have been taken solely for the benefit of the people getting rich off the record sales. I hate Nickelback, as a sentence, voices a complex opinion on cultural trends in popular music and aligns the speaker with those who hate not just Nickelback, but all that Nickelback represents. They resent Nickelback the concept. Nickelback the actual band is of secondary importance. The band's crime, other than the writing of the actual songs, is their complicity in this system. They signed the record deal. They deemed themselves worthy and deserving of this studio-constructed fame. In a phrase, they bought into it. The ire felt for Nickelback the band is only somewhat harsher than the ire felt for the fans that buy the records. They are just the first and last links in a chain of politics, studio politics, radio politics, and record politics that are seemingly ruining music. This entire chain comprises Nickelback the concept. And when people say, "I hate Nickelback," this is the Nickelback they're referring to. And when someone tweets, "I hate Nickelback" at Nickelback, they aren't really talking to the band. They're talking publicly to culture about what Nickelback represents. The actual tweet to the actual band is just a shorthand. Saying "I hate Phil Fish" became the same sort of shorthand. Phil was friends with a few dozen other indie famous developers, so he came to represent circle jerking, the idea that you got indie famous by being friends with the indie famous. Phil had government funding and impressive pixel art skills, so he came to represent the idea that money or polish or retro aesthetics, rather than gameplay, were what guaranteed press attention. So much of the conversation was about Phil, not just about Fez, that he came to represent shameless self-promotion, egomania, fame breeding fame, overemphasis on personality over product, or whatever else. Phil was not just getting undeserved attention, he was the embodiment of undeserved attention. It's worth noting that these popular beliefs about indie politics are not necessarily any of them true, but they are firmly believed. Phil Fish the concept and Phil Fish the human being orbited around each other for the 4+ years of Fez's development, and a small cottage industry grew up among reporters and bloggers of announcing whenever the two were in alignment. Indie Game the movie was filmed while Phil was legally divorcing his business partner, whom the film anonymized, and the end credits said he'd asked not to appear in the film. Shortly after release, Phil's business partner said he didn't ask not to be in the film, he was not asked to be in the film, and that he'd actually been given no opportunity to rebut Phil's account of events with his own account. This quickly became subject or citation of several articles and quickly flourished as a topic on blogs, forums, and social media. At an Indie Game the Movie panel at GDC 2012, when a Japanese man in the audience asked developers what they think of current Japanese games, Phil took the mic and said, bluntly, "They suck." Within a day, "Phil Fish says Japanese games suck" was headline news on Eurogamer, IGN, and Kotaku, among others, and the comments filled up with people calling Phil a racist. And when, later that week, Fez won the Seamus McNally Grand Prize at the Independent Games Festival, Phil took his victory lap by telling a stranger on Twitter to choke on his dick. The stranger had, per usual, insulted Phil for no reason. This also became news. 2 years later, this is still cited in articles about Phil. Now, game-related news, editorials, reviews, and criticism all fall under the same vague banner of games journalism, but none of these things are news in any traditional sense. They have no material repercussions on